Hi everyone, it's William. Boy, there's a bit of an echo in here. I hope that doesn't irritate you. I'm in one of the doctor's consulting rooms today, but I'm stationary. So I'll wait until Dmitri actually talks about his doctor's consultation before I come down here with my selfie stick and kind of show you around, and we can even walk the path that he would have taken to go to the doctor's consulting room. Anyway, what you can see behind me partly is a sink for the doctor to wash up with. And right now, if you were looking in the opposite direction, you would see a giant screen TV. It's a nice, cozy little place where people can come and watch TV. In fact, I've been watching this series in here, Davos 1917, which you can find, I'm told, on Apple TV. I don't know. I'm just watching the DVD. Anyway, yeah, it's all right. It's nothing special. But the exteriors were all shot here at Schatzalp, so that's cool. We're still on the long letter to Maria, written on the 23rd of September 1939, about 3 weeks after Dmitri had arrived at Schatzalp. Our recap from last time, he talked about his fear with this diagnosis and with not knowing what the future holds, and especially when he parted from his son, Polly, with the thought in mind that he might never see him again. And also the same with Maria. He parted from her, and she was leaving for the U.S. I'm not sure exactly when she did leave. And he tells us that he was trying to disguise his illness. I'm sure she knew that he'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis, but he was trying to disguise how dire it was. And he also talked about meeting with a Hindu doctor on the banks of the Red Sea, but he doesn't tell us what country that would have been. And it's clear, even though he calls the man a doctor, which the man may well indeed have been a medical doctor, it's clear that Dmitri was nonetheless receiving spiritual counseling from him. We'll find out a little bit more about that. So one thing I neglected to bring up yesterday when I was showing yesterday and the day before the sink that was used, that you had one in each corridor for the nurses to clean out the spit receptacles. And I mentioned that people with pulmonary TB spit stuff up all the time. So yeah, gross, but that was the reality. And there was a thing called a Blauer Heinrich. And it was a little flask made out of blue glass, and that was what you spit into. You carried it around with you, especially when you were in town, but also within the sanatorium. So if you were well enough to go into town, there was an absolute prohibition on spitting onto the ground, and you could have gotten a big fine if you'd been caught doing that. And there'd been a police officer nearby or someone who reported it, because at that time it was thought that the main form of transmission, it was wrongly thought that the main form of transition or of contagion, transmission of tuberculosis was from spit. In reality, it's the little particles, little invisible particles in the air when a person coughs or something. But the thought at that time was that the spit would hit the ground or whatever surface and would dry out. And when it was dried out, then it would get in the air, and so sort of really a roundabout way. And I don't know, that just wasn't the case. The TB dies pretty rapidly outside a host body. And so, yeah, if you're in proximity of someone who's coughing and it's in the air, then that's the usual method of transmission. It's not from somebody's dried up or evaporated spit that's been on the ground. So, but anyway, there were very strict prohibitions and high fines when it came to spitting, and so all TB patients had a receptacle of some kind. And the common one in sort of the main era of the sanatoriums was the Blauer Heinrich, so made out of this blue glass. Sorry, I don't have one with me. I'm sure there's one around somewhere, but I'll have to save that for another time. Or if you were a posh person, you could buy one that was silver. But at any rate, I'm kind of thinking that by the time Dmitri was here in the late 30s, that probably they weren't using those anymore. Maybe those sinks in the corridor actually already by that time weren't in use, because other sources I've read about people's sanatorium experiences during that time period, they were using disposable cardboard spit containers that would then be burned. So, less trouble than cleaning these disgusting things out every day. Can you imagine being the person who cleaned out the Blauer Heinrich? Oi, oi, oi. I don't think you could have paid me to do that. Not because of fear of infection, but just, gross. So anyway, yeah, that's about it for the recap. I've gone a little long with that. Our cast for today, we have two male friends, and of Dmitri's, more or less friends. One who was called the General, and another Konstantin Grunwald, so we'll talk about them. And before I really get started, I may have to actually not go as far as I was going to go today with the actual text of the letter. But so on various of the pages of the letter, Dmitri has written things in the margin. And so this is one that I decided, okay, I'll do this now. This thing that's outside of the main text and that he's written in a margin. And it says, with a certain joyfulness in his voice, as if it was entirely obvious, and Dmitri Pavlovich, he went and got himself infected with tuberculosis. And the quote, which he has in quotation marks, and Dmitri Pavlovich, he went and got himself infected with tuberculosis, that's in English, the rest is in Russian. I don't know who the he is. It's not clear also from the main body of the text who the he is who said this, or who Dmitri imagines saying this, because I don't have the Russian text with me. I only have my previously done translation. Otherwise, I could look and check and see actually if it was a specific reference to someone. But what I'm thinking, if I recall correctly, is actually that this was theoretical, that this was Dmitri thinking about how people were reacting when they found out that he'd gotten tuberculosis, which of course he'd been trying to hide, and had gone to a sanatorium, and this theoretical person would be saying, aha, he went and got himself infected with tuberculosis, as though that was some sort of failing or character flaw on his part. And that was frequently the case. I mean, if any of you are interested in that topic, I would recommend Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor, which talks about cancer and tuberculosis. Later on, she did an updated version that covered AIDS, and it's talking about the negative associations that you had with various diseases, not just that, this person was not clean enough or something like that, but about personality traits. And one of the things, that was attributed sometimes to tuberculosis and to cancer, and probably still are, is that somehow it's your fault. There's some flaw in your character that otherwise you wouldn't have gotten this disease, even though in the case of TB it's infectious, doesn't matter, the fact that you have it in the active form, it indicates some kind of character flaw. And as we know, Dmitri was a sensitive person. He got defensive very quickly. And so it's not surprising that, he's spending his time sort of obviously unconstructively thinking about the disparaging things that people are thinking about him when they find out that or saying about him when they find out he's in a sanatorium. But, oh well. Okay, here's the text that we have for today. Thanks very much for your dear letter. Despite the transportation challenge, it somehow reached me in only 10 days. It was open and far from pristine, but it arrived intact. After taking leave of you, I headed for the station, borne down by a frightful sense of heaviness in my soul. The general concealed his agitation very poorly. The station was empty, just the opposite of what one expected. Grunwald came to see me off. It was jarring to see the sleeping car after all the worries of the past few days about whether the train would be going or not. The moment came to board. Grunwald came up to me hurriedly and with a very red face shook my hand. The general threw himself at me, kissed me on the shoulder, and somehow managing to wave his hand said, "My God, how can this be happening? If you need me, just write and I will come, on foot if I have to." Then the train left, and I was once again overcome by cold fear. I was leaving Paris. The figures of the general and Konstantin Konstantinovich grew smaller, and I asked myself, how will it end? On the other side? How will it end? Question mark. On the other side? Exclamation point, question mark. No. Triple exclamation mark. Within 10 minutes, I was feeling calmer. Indian doctor, he puts in parentheses, and was filled anew with the iron determination to do all in my power to pull through, triple exclamation mark. By the next morning, we had already reached the station where one has to switch to the narrow gauge railroad that ascends into the mountains. No one approached me at the border. No one looked at my luggage. It's a pity that I didn't bring my stereoscope. Okay, so that's a funny thing to end on, but he has this divided into the letter into very definite sections. I think he didn't write it all at once. And the next section, he starts with a date, the 1st of September. But anyway, that's why I'm stopping there. Gosh, how do I fit everything in? Okay, English parts of this particular section. On the other side, no, that's written in English. And iron determination to do all in my power to pull through. That's written in English. For some reason, he seems to be putting these very emotional parts of the letter in English. We find out that Maria's letter had been opened. The war hadn't officially started yet. It was very, very close, within a day of starting. But her letter that took 10 days to reach him had not come pristine, as he says. It had been opened. Someone had scrutinized it. And I'm not sure if she left France around the same time he did and went. I don't know how long it would have taken her to get from France to the U.S., from Europe to the U.S., and then it took another 10 days for the letter to reach him. And Dmitri refers to a transportation problem. So, I don't know, maybe everything was requisitioned in anticipation of the war as far as various forms of transportation. But it's interesting, and one of the things I've really enjoyed with the Schatzalp diary is that, we find out what, in some ways, what life was like for people during the war, things I didn't know about. Okay, and let's see. So, this dinner that he had with her was the last time they ever saw each other. It was kind of their last supper. I guess I shouldn't say that. It's a little irreverent. But, yeah, at the end of the dinner, they went their separate ways. Dmitri went to the train station, and they never saw each other again, so that's very sad. She didn't go with him to the train station. Maybe he didn't want her to. I could well imagine that he didn't want her to, but at any rate, he's accompanied by the general. So who was the general? This was a man who was 7 years younger than Dmitri. His name was Vladimir Nikolaevich Wrangel, but he wasn't a brother or child of the famous general Pyotr Wrangel, who Dmitri wrote a lot about in his 1920-1921 diary entries. A very, very important man, a leader in the Civil War. No, it was a big enough family that it had different branches, and so Vladimir wasn't closely related, at least to Pyotr. As far as I know, I don't see any direct connection. But he was an employee of Dmitri's. He was, according to a friend of Dmitri's, Svetlana Kazanbek, he, I quote, looked after the affairs of Grand Duke Dmitri, and Dmitri always refers to him as the general. And I don't know why. He was quite a young man. I doubt he was actually a general. It was some kind of affectionate nickname based on what, I don't know. Dmitri never identifies him beyond that in the diaries. So I was fortunate enough to be able to find out from Paul. I remember asking him, well, who was the general? And he sort of lit up. He'd really liked this guy and said, yeah, this was Vladimir Vrango. And he was sort of my tutor. He was sort of in charge of, I think, the Russian part of Paul's education, and Paul was obviously very fond of him, so luckily I found out who he was, otherwise I'd have no idea. Okay, so then we have Konstantin Konstantinovich Grunwald, a much more equivocal figure in my mind, a very, very serious man, a very venerable man, 10 years older than Dmitri with a background in law. He had, before the revolution, served as a diplomat and also for a while in the Ministry of Finance in Imperial Russia. In emigration, he was a journalist and also a historian, a serious historian, a member of the French Academy. So, quite a highly respected academic. And he was attached to Maria. And when I say attached, I'm not even sure exactly what was going on there, because I have a couple of his letters that he wrote to her, and he seemed to have sort of appointed himself to be her spy in Europe while she was in the U.S. and to keep a watch on what Dmitri was up to, both before and after he ended up at Schatzalp. And I know he would really irritate Dmitri sometimes by calling him on the phone while he was at Schatzalp, and then he was sending these detailed letters back to Maria. I think I have them on my laptop, so I'll be able to quote the parts about Dmitri at some point. Anyway, so that makes him a little bit equivocal, that he was sort of gathering this intelligence to report back to Maria, keeping an eye on Dmitri. But the other thing is that he clearly had a thing for her. I mean, he lays it on thick. I mean, in his letters, he addresses her as my snow queen and blah, 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 all this stuff. Anyway, that was Grunwald. So we will be encountering both the general and Grunwald again, because they will continue to figure in Dmitri's diaries, even though he will not be seeing them in person anymore. Okay, and the general was so emotional. It's really quite touching, isn't it? Just call me and I'll come, even if I have to walk there. And Dmitri clearly took that as sincere. So why this belief that the trains wouldn't be running? That I don't know. Again, it seems to have to do with a general concern that transportation would completely be disrupted. Everybody was expecting the first blow to come soon. The invasion of Poland. And so Dmitri was both afraid that the trains wouldn't be running and that there would be throngs of people trying to get on the trains before they stopped running. So that's why he was so surprised to get there and see, yes, here's the train, here's my sleeping car, it's going to leave, and I'm not going to have to, push and shove my way on board like a scene out of, say, Dr. Zhivago, or any situation where people are trying to flee in advance of some catastrophe. So that was good. That was helpful. He was obviously in a greatly anxious state. So he would have been leaving. It sounds like an overnight trip because he had a sleeping car. So nowadays, if you go from Paris to Davos, you start out at the Gare de Lyon in Paris. It's a trip I make pretty much every year, both from Paris to Davos and from Davos back to Paris, although I usually stop in Zurich. And nowadays, it takes about 4 hours to get from Paris to Zurich, and then another 2.5 hours to get from Zurich to Davos. So, it's about a 7-hour trip. It's not a big deal. And I don't know how long it took Dmitri, but, and the train, he mentions that it switches to a narrow gauge track, and it does that in a town called Landquart. So you take the train from Zurich to Landquart, and then you change to the narrow gauge railway. and go up in the mountains, and it's really cool. And again, I would recommend the description in Thomas Mann's famous novel, The Magic Mountain. Even though The Magic Mountain was published in 1924, it's still the best description I've ever come across of that trip to Davos by train. Okay, so we have our poet friend back again, Dmitri, talking about the men these two men receding into the distance, and him being overcome by cold fear and asking if it will end on the other side. And all these exclamation points, the no with 3 exclamation points. Well, was he an overly dramatic person? I don't think so. I mean, you tell me if you've been watching the videos from the 1921 diary entry. He seems like a person who avoids drama. But something that we'll talk about later, one of the personality traits that was imputed to TB sufferers, not as something intrinsic to them, but something that the disease itself brought on, was this heightened, almost ecstatic state. And we'll talk about that later when it comes up again in some of Dmitri's behavior. So was it true or not? I don't know. I mean, this was such a stressful thing. I don't know that it was caused physiologically, which is what people believed at the time. Oh, because of the fever and other things, it puts them in this sort of ecstatic state. I don't know. I have a very mild form of epilepsy, and I know back at that time in 1939, people talked about the epileptic personality. So how the brain, gave you this different personality if you had epilepsy. And, I don't think that's true either. But, I think it's easily explainable just by the just tremendous pressure he was under and stress. And Dmitri was a person who always had a struggle his whole life with anxiety. I mean, after all, let's recall, he'd been through so many traumas. When Sergei Alexandrovich had been killed, his uncle, who was taking care of him, the poor kid spent the next year thinking that people were going to kill him. And agonizing over why anybody would want to kill him, and not even wanting to go out to the theater and that sort of thing for about a year because he was afraid. And then the whole thing with the revolution, his father and half-brother and the other people who were dear to him being killed in what was just kind of a bloodbath. Well, he already had that kind of tendency. So of course he's a guy who really struggles with anxiety. Anyway, then it makes me laugh a little bit. So that really heightened emotional language is followed by this very prosaic sentence about, well, they didn't even look through my stuff at customs, so I should have brought my stereoscope with me. I mean, why on earth did he think somebody would confiscate his stereoscope? And why would he even bring a stereoscope in 1939? I mean, a stereoscope, as far as I know, is just one of those things that you look through, and then it has a double picture, and they sort of merge together as you look through and make a nice kind of 3D-ish picture. Well, doesn't that belong to an earlier age? I can't imagine that would be something that he would pack to take to the sanatorium with him. So I almost wonder if he doesn't mean binoculars. I mean, they're two completely different words, but I could understand him thinking, well, maybe if I bring binoculars with me, they're going to confiscate those at customs because of the whole war situation and everybody's paranoid. But a stereoscope? Anyway, that's the word he uses. So next time we have his arrival in Davos, and he arrives in Davos on the very same day as the invasion of Poland. So, wow, yeah, not the typical Davos scene that he's arriving to. And some of what he says kind of reminds me of my own experience of in 2019 arriving in Davos slightly in advance of everything just completely shutting down because of COVID. Anyway, very different circumstances, but some of the impressions are the same. Sorry I went so long this time, and please do come back. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.